that there is conventional wisdom out there that couples in the context of parenting a child who's living with serious illness or are at greater risk for divorcing. And there is no research out there to support this question, to support this theory. What they do believe is that what the stress of co-parenting under these conditions reveals issues that were inherent in the marriage already. So it doesn't make issues, it just reveals issues. And those issues may ultimately lead the couple to separate. For many, it makes them become closer. So I just think it's important to name that. All right, so Talia, do you want to say anything before I get us started?
Yeah, just that it's such a privilege to be here and to see so many couples here, and it's so lovely to see couples together here joining us. So just really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you, to speak with you about my experiences and also what I've learned over the years from so many families I've worked with. So
thank you. So the topic tonight was dyadic coping. What is dyadic coping? I will confess that was a new word to me too. So what is that, please?
Yeah, so it's a good place to start. So what we're calling dyadic coping, sometimes referred to as communal coping or we coping. So it's really a style of coping with major stress that has been in a number of research studies linked to better outcomes. And what I mean by better outcomes here is among individual partners, lower distress, better reported adjustment to stress, reduced levels of anxiety or depression, higher quality of life, better relationship functioning or just satisfaction in relationships. So these are usually questionnaires that couples are completing, describing a style of coping. And that's been associated in a number of studies with better outcomes. What it actually means is, so if I'm engaging in dyadic coping, what that means is that my partner and I are first and foremost, we are perceiving a stress as our problem, as something that we consider to be what we sometimes call a we problem, as opposed to something that's your problem versus my problem. So if I tend to run high on anxiety and you tend not to run high on anxiety, if we're engaging in this kind of coping style, we're saying that's our anxiety to manage. And with that kind of mindset, the idea is that falling out of that mindset would be a more collaborative sort of approach to managing stress, to solving problems. So we're considering it a problem that we both are facing together. We're sort of in the same weather system in a sense. And as a result, we're approaching the problem as something that we resolve together as well. So that's kind of the gist of it. It's a fairly intuitive idea. It's a somewhat abstract idea. I think the reason it was named and frankly, it was first studied actually in couples and described in couples who are dealing with an illness, a medical illness in one partner. But the reason I think this was distinguished and named was that it really sort of recognizes that the way we cope with stress, that it does not happen in a vacuum. In other words, the way in which I respond to major stress is going to be shaped by and will also shape the partner I'm with. And so there's this way that we're living in a sort of two-person system, a kind of village of two in a sense, is the way sometimes that gets described. And that both our stress levels, but also the way we respond to stress is going to be very, very closely linked. And I think that's the.
Oh, Talia, we just lost your audio. No, that's so strange.
Second.
Oh, there you are.
There you are. Okay, great. Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. Mystery. Um, I will say that I would have loved this when we were going through this together, because my husband and I were that couple where he responded one way to stress and I responded a completely different way to stress, and it was not helpful.
Mhm.
Until like, if why are you anxious when I'm just trying to stay calm, and why are you calm, we need to be anxious. And it was like this third issue in our, like, it was just that was a not helpful for us.
Yeah, I think so there are many examples of this that I think would be familiar to all of us. So a couple can have very complementary coping styles, right? One person becomes more sort of pragmatic and takes charge of practical tasks, while the other person serves as more of kind of an emotional cheerleader. There are times when there's, a lot of synergy in that. And there are times when the two styles will, as you're describing, seem to collide or compete with one another. So if I'm a person who, when I become overwhelmed with anxiety or fear or stress, tends to need to disengage, to sort of decompress and move away from a lot of stimulation, and you're a person who responds to stress by needing a lot of engagement and connection, your way of relieving stress is going to obviously conflict with what I'm needing in that moment. And so you can imagine, and all of us, I think, are in relationships where this happens, that these styles can seem to compete with one another, and certainly can kick up a lot of tension.
What role does empathy play in that? Because, having sympathy, I see you, I see this is how you're responding. I respect that, even though I find it threatening in a way. And I need you to see me having my reaction over here and not be offended or threatened by it. Like, how do you, where does the empathy piece come from? Or what role does that play?
Yeah, so empathy is tricky, because I think when we are, typically when we're feeling under threat ourselves, it's very difficult for us to, sometimes the way I'll describe it is you're standing at the edge of a cliff looking down, and your capacity in that feeling state, your capacity to turn to your partner and tune into what they're feeling and make sense of it and understand it is going to be very, very next to zero. So empathy happens, I think, when we are regulated, when we're sort of feeling grounded emotionally. And I say that not to say that there's not a role for empathy, but I think we do need to sort of respect our own kind of natural alarm system and understand when we are available for empathy and when we're not. That said, what you're describing there is, I think, very important in terms of knowing who your partner is and knowing who you are under stress. So what is the sort of, what gets activated when I'm under stress, and who do I become? What do I need in order to relieve stress? And that will be different for each person. There's this idea of sort of becoming kind of an expert in your partner. And I think when you know that, and you know the history of that and the context of that, how did you get to be someone who tends to withdraw? How did you get to be someone who tends to cling or tends to seek out or become active or distract? When you know that about someone, and a lot of the work I do with couples is about getting to know those things, then it becomes more predictable. We don't get blindsided, and we have we can put it in its place. So we're a little bit less likely to take it personally, essentially, or to feel dropped by it.
That's so helpful. And that is definitely the work that the counselor we were working with helped us do. I mean, I learned more about my husband, who I'd been married to for a number of years and had been with for longer than that, during our experience than I mean, I don't know when eventually I would have learned some of that if it weren't for the tremendous stress we were under. That I was like, wait, I've never seen this side of you. What do you mean? And she was our second child. I was like, I've never seen this side of you. Oh my God. So that was, you know, in ways that were beautiful when I came to understand it, but it was like, it was another thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you, are there any practical things, you know, there are people here on who aren't you're not working with them. They probably would like to be working with you, but they're not. Are there practical things that people can do to figure that out, that in the safety, like without a facilitated professional there?
Yeah, so you know, some of this, a lot of this comes down to sort of willingness to talk about this stuff, right? One of the things that gets looked at in a lot of research on couples coping with illness is something that's called that they call relationship awareness. So, and it's sort of what we're talking about. So are we willing to ask ourselves, how is this impacting each of us individually? How is this impacting each of us? What are we noticing about, what am I noticing about what I do under stress and what you do under stress? And so, you know, the sort of concrete piece here would be to have those conversations. There's actually a really nice question guide that I'm just realizing now I could get to you as a resource that was published, that it's written for clinicians, but I think could be very readable and easy to use for anyone really. And it was developed by a team at University of Arizona who essentially like put together a set of questions and sort of thought exercises for couples in order to cultivate this dyadic coping piece. So it would be sort of a series of questions that you would sit down and get through together. And it's things like, you know, what is the impact of this? What have we been through before that drove our stress up? And what do we know about how we cope with that? I mean, there's a whole variety of things, but it's there to sort of help prompt communication about this stuff more than anything else. So I don't know if that answers your question. But
it does actually. It sounds like a very helpful external tool to use. Like you could lean on it, like bring out the piece of paper and say, okay, let's ask this question, as opposed to, I just think that a lot of this stuff is hard to initiate, right? It takes some vulnerability to initiate.
I'm glad you mentioned that actually. So, you know, here's the other thing that I often will talk to couples about. You know, so much of our relational life becomes sort of automated. Just because it's less work for us. Our brains are designed to conserve energy. So if I can make you as predictable as possible and automate as much as possible, then it's easier, right? And that works for the most part. What happens is that when there's a really challenging stressor, and a chronic stressor like a medical illness, we can't rely so much on what's become automatic, because it makes us very prone to errors in appraisal. So in other words, I'm much more likely to misunderstand or misread you under stress, under chronic stress, than I would be otherwise. And the implication of that, what that means is that we as a couple have to be a lot more intentional about looking at our relationship and protecting our relationship. In other words, because we're up against, there's so much load bearing on the marriage from dealing with an illness and all that's involved, not to mention the more the larger amount of time we spend apart because of the divide in responsibilities and things like that. So there's so much there's so much more stacked against us, that to just rely on what's become automatic between us doesn't work anymore. And often I will really sort of press couples to be much more, as I said, sort of intentional and thoughtful about their relationship. So the kind of conversation that I'm talking about with these questions that none of us, we wouldn't normally have or put effort into, under these conditions becomes very protective.
Mm-hmm. And what happens if one person brings out the little list of questions and is like, okay, let's go, and the other person is like, no?
Right. So that's tough, right? So there are a couple of things come to mind here. First of all, very common that one partner wants to talk, express, verbalize things. Another partner, is just either not in the habit of doing that or doesn't see it as useful. And so a couple of things here. One is that the approach matters. And if I'm approaching my partner and saying, hey, let's sit down and just talk about, I got this list of questions, or I'd like us to talk about how we're doing together as a couple, as a team, as partners, that we want to do that in a way, we want to be able to use what John Gottman calls a soft startup. He has, so this is a very well-known marital researcher who's observed that when couples approach a difficult topic in a softer way, we can all sort of imagine what that looks like. There's a lot more, you maximize the chances, obviously, that your partner is going to be able to receive it and not feel criticized, not feel defensive, so on and so forth. So what does this look like? So what I will often see couples do, or partners do, the talking partner, the pursuer, so to speak, will approach by calling on sort of shoulds. We really should, or I read this thing, or I spoke to so-and-so, and as opposed to, I'm thinking it would really make me feel a lot more comfortable, or it would make me feel a little bit safer, or it would make me feel less anxious if we could try this thing. And would you be willing to? And you're looking for willingness, really, more than anything else. So there are any number of ways to do that. And I don't mean to script it too much, but just to say that the approach matters. If we're making a request, the approach matters. The other thing I'll say about the talking in general is that, I've come over the years to realize that I've seen enough couples who don't talk and do well together to understand, to recognize that open verbal communication is not the only path to feeling connected and shoring up like a sense of teamwork. And so I think there are other ways to feel connected to someone and to let them know that either, that this is impacting us or that our relationship matters, essentially.
Can you give us an example? Yeah. Like what would,
if I know that you are, if I know that you're someone who really appreciates me being around and showing interest in something that you're interested in, if I know that you're someone who likes to take walks to decompress and not talk, but just be together in that way, I'm going to be willing to do that, even though it's not the ideal thing in my mind, the ideal way to connect in my mind. I'm going to make myself available for opportunities to connect in positive ways. And the other thing that's within my power as the partner who's wanting to work at protecting the relationship is that I can start to pay attention, and this is really not easy, I can start to really pay attention to what you're doing well and notice it and appreciate it and be out loud about it. And often as parents, and certainly parents who are caregiving and carrying such a huge load and experiencing so much traumatic stress often, often parents are very praise deprived. And really do not get a whole lot of sense of appreciation. And I can't emphasize enough how critical it is to be saying thank you, to be noticing things. And again, especially when we're under chronic stress, we tend to, our alarm system tends to be very activated, and we tend to be very much more tuned into threat and negative, perception of threat, or very sensitive to what's happening that isn't going well. We're often scanning the environment. I mean, that's just the way we're wired, but it's even more amplified when we're under chronic stress. So to pay attention to what we're doing well and to notice that out loud, I think can go a long way, even for someone who's not a big talker.
That's very helpful. It touches upon you. Listening to you, I got thinking about how couples can find time to not just communicate about what's going on with their child or their children, but to connect as a couple, take care of themselves as a couple, go on a date, have dinner together. We did hear from some parents when they sent us questions like, don't tell us to go on a date. If we could go on a date, we would obviously go on a date. What is a more practical way when we don't have time? How can we connect in the absence of opportunity to have a true alone time? What tips do you have for that?
Boy, I could use some tips myself. I'm going to be beating a dead horse here. It sounds very repetitive, but again, like I really love the way you read to Sarah last night, or I really loved watching you, when I heard you on the phone with the doctor, and I just felt so safe in watching you advocate for us or ask questions. I mean, I can't emphasize enough, like, how much connection gets cultivated when we feel seen by our partner and feel that we are being noticed for what's going well. So I do want to, only because that's one of the sort of 30 seconds or less things we can do. I'm going to keep coming back to that. Look, in terms of alone time, it's a conversation, I think. How do we make this happen? And I would just caution against putting too much pressure on yourselves to make that time, or too much of a demand on yourself to feel desire, attraction, all of that. I think, if we can sit together, sometimes time sitting together in parallel play can be very comforting. And so, some of this is a conversation about what closeness looks like. Like, you might ask yourself, when do I feel close to my partner? Like, what am I noticing these days about under what conditions I tend to feel close to him or her? And it's a conversation about how we find that time together. I will say that when couples come to see me in counseling, I think often the time they're dedicating to working with a counselor it creates a kind of bubble for them.
Oh yeah.
And that should not count as a date night, but it does count as something in the sense that it's a tribute to we are in some ways standing up here for our relationship. We're paying attention to our relationship. So anything like that where we're paying attention to each other can be helpful. But look, I think if I really do understand the frustration with the self-care kind of mandate, right?
The word that came to mind as I was listening to you talk about sort of the validation and I see you, and was the word tenderness. Like, can you show your partner tenderness? That doesn't have to be sexy or intimate, just tender. And like that, that's an easier thing to muster than a date feeling, I think. Or I'm positing that that's an easier thing to muster and bring in, I think. So another question, and I'm going to ask one more question before we open it up. The whole notion of dividing and conquering, we've automated the dividing and conquering. A lot of CPN families have children living with for years and years with medical complexity. So they're in the groove, hopefully, maybe they're in the groove, and you're doing this and I'm doing this. And if you're lucky, you're in a groove. But do you have recommendations? That's great that you have a groove, but every now and then you should pause and see in on the groove, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. So what I encourage couples to do is to allow themselves to periodically reevaluate how we've set this thing up, and how much space is taken up by this illness. Many medical illnesses, and I work in oncology, so I'm most familiar with the course of a cancer diagnosis, which of course itself has a lot of variation. But one of the things that I often will emphasize is that different phases of illness call for different kinds of coping and different ways the family needs to organize. So in a crisis phase, or if there's a hospital admission, there tends to be, the family tends to allocate resources, that is time, energy, thought, planning goes into the crisis. Everything else gets backburnered. We might notice that in a crisis, we take on very specific roles and very structured roles. We might notice that our relationship with medical providers in a crisis phase is very particular. So we might tend to be more passive and allow more other systems to kind of enter in and take charge in ways, again, in that kind of phase. These are some of the ways that families will organize in a crisis. And so when we're out of the crisis and we're now in a chronic phase of illness, that calls for a very different way of managing. And one of the places where I see families sometimes get stuck is in making that transition from crisis to chronic. So if I'm still in crisis mode and the illness is not demanding that of me at this moment, that's going to create some difficulties for me. So what we do as a couple and the way we distribute tasks in a crisis mode needs to be different than when we're in a different stage of the illness. And it's something that I think we don't often think about when we're in the trenches, and so it can be helpful to notice. So that would be a reason to periodically check in. How do we have this set up? What are our roles? What do our roles tend to be? Is that still working? Is there a new job, or is there another demand, caring for a parent or some other stressor, a child going off to college? There might be other things that really require us to take a look and see whether things need to be redistributed. So sometimes we only notice that it's a problem when we haven't made the adaptation, and we find ourselves stuck in a place that we're very unhappy about. And what can happen then is we turn to our partner and like, why are you not, we direct a lot of that frustration at our partner. And a lot of what I'm doing with couples is sort of pulling them out of the relationship and looking at the map of, where are we and what needs to change about how we've had this set up. So
I love that, pulling back the lens. I mean, we all lose perspective in our normal days of just normal life without crisis, without having a child who's sick. Like, we just lose perspective all the time. So pulling back the lens. I remember a mom told us, a mom who did this for a number of years with her husband, taking care of their son. She talked about how they use the word, is it time to renovate? Like, we've been doing this for years. Now let's see, do we need to renovate how we're doing this? And she used the example of a house. Like, does our house need an updo? And they applied that. I mean, they weren't talking about their house. They were talking about their marriage and their divide and conquer and their division of labor.
The other metaphor. So what I'll often say to families is that a medical illness can feel like an intruder in the family, or like another member of the family in a sense. And that in a sense, our task is always to give it a place, to dedicate time, resources to it, and to keep it in its place at the same time. And that's a balance that we're always having to calibrate. So how are we doing at keeping it in its place, at giving it enough of a place? What's getting sort of off, being pushed off the table as a result? And there are examples of this all the time, graduations that get disrupted when someone needs to be at an appointment or a medical appointment, or even just the way in which medical appointments are set up often can dictate our time, the schedule, the routine of a week. Families become very accustomed to that, but and some of that, of course, is out of your hands. But I think there are aspects of it that are more within your control than it might seem. And you only notice that when you do that kind of zoom out and take a look at where we are. One of the exercises I sometimes do with couples is to do sort of a pie chart of, so if we were to pick like major priorities for us in our life, things that are important to us, family, health, work, exercise, I don't know what else, spirituality. And we each made a pie chart where we sort of divided it up, our time, to say sort of how much of our time is dedicated to each of these things. So first of all, would we come up with the same pie chart? So are we seeing things generally the same way? And second of all, looking at how we're distributing things, are there changes we would want to make? And how is this different than before? So what's gotten smaller, what's gotten bigger? It's one way to.
It's a pause and look. It makes so much sense. I mean, really, for anybody, actually. I have other questions that I think will yield some other good stuff, but maybe some questions should come from the people who are here. So I want to invite you to put your questions into the chat. Oh, and Gabrielle is saying that, so just so much grief in such a very, very short period of time. I guess, so I wonder, and we did have another question about that, the whole grieving. I mean, grief is woven throughout all of this, of course, but specifically like being very intentional about looking at grieving and how two people grieve differently. how much of your work with couples or in dyadic coping communication with couples addresses grief directly?
Yeah, yeah. So grief is sort of it's there all along, and in some version, and some, there's some sense that parents are often grieving. Certainly after a loss, obviously it becomes very, it sort of comes to the fore very intensely. Um, the basis of any couples work is just what you said, that people, to make room for different ways of grieving. And it's not easy. It's really not easy. And so the benefit of seeing someone together, and I will say that, I think I think most people end up pursuing grief counseling individually, is my sense. And I think there's a lost opportunity there to really tap what's a kind of a natural resource in the sense of your partnership. And it can work both ways. And there are times when someone might feel that they really need the space themselves to grieve and to express what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. But I think there's a benefit to meeting with someone together where you can, again, notice, but, have someone else, really a third person, sort of notice these different grieving styles, and help you know what's there, know what I'm looking at, what kind of animal am I with? What does this person do? And how can I understand that better? So much of this is about perception, about how I'm reading you, how I'm tuning into you, and what I'm making of your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And we get into we make mistakes all the time. And we get into very dangerous territory when we overinterpret our partner as not caring, not being supportive enough. There's this really interesting study done years ago by the Gottman Lab, and it gets cited very often, where they had couples. So they would do these studies that I don't think you could do as easily anymore now, where they would invite couples into an apartment, essentially a laboratory apartment. They would have them live there for a number of days. And they would have like video cameras trained on them, and then they'd have them hooked up to all sorts of physiological measurements. And they would watch, and part of the goal here was to see whether we could, they were asking, like, could you, based on a sliver of a couple's life together, could you predict how this couple will fare many, many years ahead? And they would follow these couples for decades. So one of the things that they observed was that there were these instances that, I think we're all very familiar with, where one partner would become very distressed and another partner would appear to shut down or withdraw. So that's a very common pairing, right? And any of us could be the withdrawer or the person who gets upset at any moment. What was interesting was that the person who appeared to be shut down or withdrawn, who was disengaged and preferring not to take on stress, when they looked at their physiological measurements, they were through the roof, heart rate, cortisol levels, sweat response, all of these measures of somatic anxiety, much, much higher than the person who appeared to be much more expressive about their distress. So I think it's a very powerful, for me, kind of lesson in understanding that we are very prone to misinterpreting, for one thing. And also to understand that my partner is, whatever behavior I'm seeing in my partner in grief, for example, is their solution to distress as much as mine is my solution to distress. And I think that frame can sometimes be extremely helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the definition of dyadic, right? Like, we're doing the same work. We have the same project to do, which is to cope and do this thing together, and we're just doing it in a different way, but in fact we have the same goal, and just being reminded of that.
Yeah.
And that what you see isn't necessarily what's actually going on in there. Um, wow, that I'll be thinking of the couple in the lab in the apartment. If does any, there haven't been any more questions put in the chat. I can read aloud some of the questions that came up in that people sent ahead of time in the event nobody wants to put their question to their name. So please, but honestly, like we're all here for the same reason. So please, the
Well, if I can ask a question.
oh yes,
I
please.
think
Listen.
reflects some of the questions that were entered, but I'm going to generalize it a little bit for you. So sometimes one partner is dealing with their own stuff that's separate from the caregiving. It could be a very stressful job. It could be difficulty in other relationships out of the family. It could be something from their own childhood experience. And what is the responsibility to the other partner or the role to help with that, while you acknowledge it's their own body of work that they need to do as an individual, but knowing that it's impacting the partner relationship?
Yeah.
Like, there's a tension there sometimes, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so this would be an area where I think one version of this would be when one partner is struggling with mental health needs that or is predisposed to a high level of emotional distress that again might be pre-existing the child's illness, and can kind of spin out of control in the context of all that stress. So if I have a partner who is struggling in that way, or who's drinking heavily, or struggling with some other issue like that, I'm certainly not responsible for fixing their issue. And often it goes way out of, way beyond my wheelhouse. I am responsible for communicating with them about my own stress around this and my own unhappiness. And the reason is that even if I'm unhappy in a marriage or relationship, and my partner is not unhappy, we're both in the same weather system, and it's part of my sort of responsibility or my way of taking care of the relationship to make that known. Beyond that, unfortunately, there's a limit to how much I can do. So if I have a partner who is reluctant to get care for themselves, and this happens, it's pretty common actually. I'm left to sort of control what I can control, and sometimes that's my own self-care, but it's certainly continuing to communicate about it as best I can. Mm-hmm. And it's hard.
And it sounds like naming what that experience is like for you.
Yeah.
Right.
So again, it's not from I think about the soft versus hard startup. So it's not from a place of as best I can of judgment, but I'm worried. This makes me uncomfortable. It makes me feel less secure in this relationship. It makes me worry about X, Y, and Z. It would help me worry less if you considered, as opposed to you have a problem. You're not getting it fixed. It's just like your mother, that's a path that's not going to go well. So again, there are ways to approach, but in terms of what is my responsibility, it reminds me of this other issue, which is that couples do well when they have a sense of like a shared purpose, and also these sort of like, a relation. There's someone, Stan Tatkin, who developed this psychobiological approach to couples therapy. He likes to say that a relationship doesn't really exist. In other words, it's not something we can visualize. It's not something we can scan to see if there's a fracture there. It's really an idea. It's a set of ideas. And it's an idea about how to be together and why to be together. And so as a couple, you're creating, in a sense, those ideas. So you decide what this relationship is about. And it becomes, I think, to help protect against the sort of like fluctuations that can happen, getting yanked around by stressors, we need to have a kind of social contract, a way of thinking about what are the principles of this relationship? What do we do and not do? And that will be both a shared sort of shared values. So who are we as a relationship? What do we stand for? And also a shared vision. Where are we going together? What are we about? So examples of these kinds of principles are, we're radical defenders of one another. We protect each other in private and in public. We prioritize our relationship. When we've hurt one another, we make repair. We try to make repair quickly. We turn, when my partner is in distress, I turn toward them. I lean in, I ask about it, I tend to it. So these are examples of sort of like principles, right? And all of you have those probably somewhat implicitly, like there are lines you don't cross. There might be lines you don't cross. There are couples who have different lines, but many of us might say that there are certain things we agree ethically to do or not do. So in that sense, we're involved in honoring something about our relationship. And I think when one partner is drowning or is really at risk or in trouble in some way, my responsibility to the relationship is to say something. So that's the extent to which I think there's a sense of responsibility.
Thank you for that. And we've got another question here, which reflects, again, another thing that we had in our earlier questions. So this is someone describing, going through this journey with your child, witnessing traumatic medical experiences, feeling emotionally numb. Someone else had described like feeling a lack of joy. If you're feeling that emotional absence, how do I connect in that state? And I'll add just my own piggyback to that. Is there a fake it until you make it sort of component to connecting, which I sometimes talk about when I'm working with individuals who are struggling with something?
Yeah. No, I love that you brought that up, actually, because that is that's something I often will say. So what's being described there is something that we call hypoarousal, which is actually a component. It's a fancy word for that kind of component of post-traumatic stress. So that is a post-traumatic stress reaction. And just like hyperarousal, which is, we think about fight, flight, or freeze. And now there's another one, fawn. So they keep adding to that set of stress responses. But that is a response of a solution to a state of alarm, essentially, is to disconnect. And I think the first thing I would say to anyone who's experiencing that is that is a very sort of a it's a exquisitely protective system for getting you out of an overwhelmed and flooded state. And we want to, I think, first of all, respect what it's doing and acknowledge what it's doing as part of that kind of traumatic stress response. And often, and so that can look like numbing out, feeling helpless, sometimes depressed. But certainly so the problem with it, or the way it gets challenging, is that the way our emotional system and our nervous system works is that I can't just shut off one part and not another part. So when I'm shutting off negative feelings, I'm also shutting off positive feelings. And that's where we get stuck feeling, in this experience, a very strange experience of walking around feeling so disconnected and absent. Probably, and maybe this is obvious, but I find that it's not so obvious for many couples I see, that, as you were saying earlier, Chrissy, naming that. Often when I'm explaining to couples what that is and that it's a known response to stress and part of our wiring, really, that alone can bring a lot of relief to a partner who is, again, otherwise misinterpreting that or becoming frustrated with it. And I'll just acknowledge that even if I understand that my husband or wife is or partner is experiencing that, and even if I understand that that's a post-traumatic stress response, I might still feel a loss there, and I might still feel in many ways, a real sense that absence may be very painful for me. Mm-hmm. So that too has to be acknowledged, I think.
I want to ask a quick follow-up to that, and I also realize we're getting close to the top of the hour, so I want to get to one final question after my follow-up. And the follow-up question is the role of compartmentalization in this dynamic. When one person is capable of compartmentalizing and the other isn't, and what's the function in this circumstance that we're describing with the hypoarousal and engagement?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. So are you thinking about compartmentalizing as a dimension of the hypoarousal or something separate?
Or as a tool or strategy even? Does it have a role? We often think of that word as being a negative.
Yeah,
like,
no.
People get labeled as compartmentalizers, right? And
it's different. So I would think about those things as very different, actually. So when I think about compartmentalizing, I think of that as you were saying, as an adaptive tool. And some of us are better.
I think about it as adaptive.
Yeah. And some of us are better, have that capacity to sort of distract more easily from certain content, right? So that can be very adaptive. And I don't want to assume that the person asking the question is actually experiencing this, because there are different degrees of absence or disconnection, but the kind of disconnection that leaves you feeling chronically or consistently numb is a different, that feels to me like a different thing. Yeah. The fake it till you make it, I just wanted to say, is absolutely a good guideline in general, but not an easy pitch.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then I'm going to shift to Blythe for a minute. Blythe, you had a follow-up question.
Well, I'm curious what you do with couples when there is not alignment around either a decision they are wrestling with on behalf of their child or their expectations about prognosis. Mom is less optimistic than dad, or whatever. That's just a simple example. What do you do when parents aren't on the same page?
Yeah. So the first thing I do is normalize that. So I have not yet met a family where everyone has the same perception of prognosis. And in fact, I would even argue that it can be useful to have different perspectives. When the prognosis itself, according to the medical team or the information you're getting, is ambiguous, which it often is, it falls to the family, in a sense, to cover all the scenarios. And some family members will be better suited for taking on the more hopeful, positive perspective. And often it's a match for them in some way. And other family members take on the job, in a sense, of holding another kind of reality. And I describe it as jobs that families members have, in a sense, because the family as a whole, as a system, has to find a way to sit with often contradictory and opposing views. So a family in which all members are thinking very pessimistically is not necessarily an adaptive, right? That you can imagine that causing trouble in some ways. A family in which all family members are thinking very optimistically might miss certain things as well. So I mean, in the extremes, obviously. So it's not to say that it's right or wrong, but I try to point to the potential benefits of having a diversity of perspectives. Okay. Now, the trick is, how do we help these things work together rather than compete with each other? And there, what I often tell couples is, you don't, if you, by understanding what, by really trying to understand or making an effort to understand what it means to your partner to hold this belief or idea, whether it's a treatment decision or whatever, does not commit you to agreeing with them. You don't have to agree with your partner, but it is, again, part of what makes a relationship feel better to you and to your partner if you make an attempt or an effort to understand where they're coming from. Why is this important to you? Why does it matter to you? What is it here that you really care about? Mm-hmm. So and the reason I say that, it sounds very sort of, kind of mushy and idealistic in some ways, but there's very practical implications here. So because what happens is that if I feel understood by you, I'm much more likely to be more flexible in my position. If I feel that you are dismissing or invalidating my perspective, what I'm going to do is hold on to it even tighter, and I'm going to become more inflexible, and we're going to end up looking a lot more polarized than we actually are. So that's the part that we want to avoid. And the understanding part is not just it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's actually a tool for softening the positions that we're in and helping us, be more flexible in our perspective. And from a place of flexibility, we're just a lot more willing to collaborate, to problem solve, to find a win-win, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us really back to the beginning, which is this notion of, if we can remind each other. And, I do want to flag, because we didn't say this at the beginning, that this doesn't just hold true for the two people who are, if you're married or co-parenting in the same house. This could hold true for divorced parents who are co-parenting their child. Like these, you don't have the same intimacy challenges, but you do still have the same, role and decision making that. But bring us back to the beginning, which is, at the end of the day, we want the same thing, which is the best for our child. And if we can just remember that and come back to the very, very, very first principle, that then we can start again. Like, we have to reboot and just be reminded of that.
Yeah, the start again is such a helpful thing to remember, because it's very hard to prevent clashes, stress, misunderstandings, but I think to know that you can always make repair afterward, you can come back. The last thing I just wanted to say, to circle back to your first, what you said at the very beginning, and on a sort of a hopeful note, so this question of, are parents of medically ill children more likely to separate or divorce? And I think anecdotally, a lot of us get the idea that is a high risk. So there actually was a study in 2020. There are very few studies out there on this, but there was a very good study in 2020 that followed 8,000 families with a child who was diagnosed with cancer under the age of 18, and compared them to couples of healthy children. And what they found was that the risk of separation and divorce was actually lower for parents of a medically ill child, by something like 5 to 8%. So a small amount, but lower, but actually lower. And I thought that was really, I wanted to mention that just because it's sort of, it suggests that we tend to overestimate, I think, the kind of damage that can be done under the strain of dealing with the child's illness. And I think in doing that, we miss a lot of the ways that couples find resilience, find each other, find connection, find relief, find refuge in their relationship.